people who were the very poorest of poor and people who were the the wealthiest had to come to the temple to make sacrifice, to observe this Passover. And it was required that every male person bring a half a shekel as a temple tax. But the shekel that you earned in Galilee, 90 miles to the north, or even if you were in Joppa, which is on the coast, maybe 60 miles to the west, that shekel didn't work. You had to bring it to the temple area and have it exchanged for a temple shekel. And there was, of course, a tax on that exchange, like there is today when you go to those currency exchange places at the airport. But not just that, people brought sacrifices, animals. Of course, you couldn't travel with goats, couldn't travel with sheep. It's too cumbersome. So they had pens of animals there that you could buy. There was a surcharge, of course, on those kinds of animals because they were thought to be pure, unblemished. Turtle doves, pigeons. If you could only afford a small offering, you could buy that there as well, and that was also surcharged. In other words, what was going on here is that this was the center not only of religion, but it was the Mall of Americas sort of thing. It was a massive commercial enterprise. And we know what Jesus felt when he walked into the Temple Mount, because he loses it in a sense. I don't mean that disrespectfully, but he has been angry at other times in the gospel story. But here he sees people taking full advantage of other people for the sake or in the name of religion. The ancient records show that there were up to 3,000 head of livestock within this temple area at any one time. And so Jesus walks in and he sees there's no place for people. There's no place for worshipers. In fact, the whole thing, if you look at it carefully, is they're sectioned off. The big white sections are the places where the Gentiles could be. That's where the commerce took place. And that's where the Gentiles could worship. And then the rectangle within the larger rectangle, that was the temple area proper. And the larger of the white boxes, that's where the women could go and worship. And closer to the Holy of Holies were the men, and closer to that were the priests, and closer to that were the Levites, and closer to that was the holy porch, and closer to that was the holy room. And then at the very highest point of the great temple was the Holy of Holies. We'll talk about that later. But I want you to see that Gentiles were made to stay in a certain area of the Temple Mount. Women in a certain area, men in another area. And the problem that Jesus sees is that these Gentiles have to share the space with all the animals and money changers and all the people that are raking in money off the temple tax. And this is what makes him angry. And this is why he goes to some kind of shepherd and gets a stick, or he goes to some kind of goat herder and gets a whip and begins to drive people out with the stick or with the whip. Move people out because he wants the Gentiles to have a place to worship. Now listen, stay with me. This is a critical part. Jesus says, and I want you to look at it very carefully. Look at it in chapter 21. Verse 13. Just look at the punctuation marks. Quote, "It is written," Jesus says, close quote, "He said to them," quote, you with me? Small quote, "My house will be called a house of prayer." Close that small quote. "But you have made it a," small quote again, "den of robbers." Close that small quote and then close the quote. What he's saying is, look, my house shall be called as Isaiah said, a house of prayer for all nations. But you, as Jeremiah said, have made it a den of robbers. Jesus is going back in time 700 years before his own day to pull up what the prophet Isaiah said about the temple. And I want to read to you what the prophet Isaiah said about the temple. You can go with me if you'd like to Isaiah chapter 56. You can find it for yourself, but let me tell you what he said. Isaiah chapter 56 says, look, this is God speaking, to the eunuchs, that is, and this is a sad thing, but there were, the spoils of war meant that people would be enslaved, men would be enslaved, and to put them into service inside of courts where there were women, these men would be surgically altered. And they were the least of the least. They were enslaved by their own bodies now, through their own bodies, to be outside the field of what it means to be a follower of God. They were Gentiles and forever surgically made Gentiles. So they're way, way off the reservation when it comes to being a good Jew. And God says to the people in Isaiah chapter 56, he says, to those who are eunuchs, but who keep my Sabbath in their heart, who choose what pleases me, who hold fast to my covenant, to them, those people, I will give within my temple and its walls a memorial and a name, better than sons and daughters. I'll give them an everlasting name, and they will not be cut off. That is, those people who by virtue of nothing of their own fault, but have found themselves imprisoned and surgically set apart, those people I will give a special name because they observe my Sabbath. Because in their heart they love me. And verse 8 is, and foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord to serve him, to love the name of the Lord and to worship him, all who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it and who hold fast to my covenant, these I'll bring to my holy mountain, which is the temple, and give them joy in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. Jesus goes back 700 years, and he quotes this amazing message of the prophet Isaiah from God, that the people of God who are chosen should have an outreach ministry to everyone who is outside the Jewish faith. I want to be sure that you understand something about this. God chose the Jews to play out his story of redemption, but it wasn't to keep them as a favored nation only. They were chosen, they were favored, but that meant they were selected. They were selected to bear the good news of God's love for the nations. God had told the prophet Abraham, he said, that you will be a great nation, and by you all the nations will be blessed. You get what I'm saying? And the Jews of the temple period that we're talking about here had circled the wagons and said, we have ours. We don't need to do anything else. We have what we need. God has blessed us. God has chosen us. God has favored us.
We thank you for joining us online. The ministries of Christ Church Plano are made possible by generous contributions from our members and viewers. If you have found this sermon meaningful and would like to make a gift of support, please visit christchurchplano.org/give. Thank you.